Well, good morning. How did it end last night in the Old Town? Was it all good? A quick show of hands, who got to the last destination of the bar crawl map? No? No one? Those who, yeah, they're not here. Those who got to the last. I always thought it was not a good idea to hand out those maps, but in any case, that's on the organizers. Actually, I have a regret. You remember Gilan from yesterday? I wanted to get him good and drunk and so that he spills his beans on how he does these numbers tricks, but he didn't come. So we would have to employ other methods to discover his secrets. A lot of security people here, you might suggest something that might work with him. Anyways, glad to see you back. Second day of our very important conference here. Just a couple of announcements before we begin with our first panel. For those of you who are joining us and who weren't here yesterday, we have a conference dedicated application for your smartphones. So you have the link for download in your registration emails, but it can also be found on the internet. Basically, STRATCOM events, you'll find the application, a lot of useful information there. It's not all printed out, it's in the application. Also, if you, we would actually encourage you to use our wireless network. To, when you connect on the network, you are supplying your email address, and there's going to be a digital health test by STRATCOM analysts made on the basis of that email address, basically to find out what sort of publicly available personal information is easily available on you on the internet. Quite a scary health test, but it's useful to know that. And anonymized overview of what has been gathered will be presented by the organizers at the end of the event. We will not embarrass you publicly. The data will be deleted after the event, so it's all good. It's an experiment, a useful one. But please do take part. The more people take part in that, the more fun we will have in the end with the data. All right, there's also going to be an interesting book presentation at 2 o'clock, but I will remind you of that when it comes closer, but something to bear in mind. All right, that's about it for the opening part. Let us begin with our first panel. Let me invite Marina Gorpis, Katie Woodward, Ramsey Brown to the stage here, and let me introduce Eric Applewhite. Yes, please. Over there. Eric Applewhite, he's Director of Technology and Transformation at KPMG, and he's going to be our moderator for our session, first session for today on artificial intelligence, big data, and all the practical and philosophical questions that arise out of it. So, Eric, you want to do it from here or over there? It's up to you. It's, the floor is yours until 11:30.
That's great.
All right.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You all okay? You're the diehards. We really appreciate you coming to talk to us. I am Eric Applewhite. I have the pleasure of facilitating what I think will be a really interesting panel on how we as human beings maintain free will in the rise of a digital age and the increase of data, where we know that data can certainly be used for good. It can be used to protect democratic values and the rights that each of our countries and societies value, but it can also be used for ill. I've got a lapel pin. Some of you have asked me about it yesterday, and it just says #DataSavesLives. And I've had a number of really interesting conversations with people about that, not just in places like this, but in coffee houses and everywhere. And what I like is it creates a human conversation about ourselves and the impact of data, and how increasingly that will shape, I think, our well-being, our democratic institutions. So one of the things that I hope will please you is the diversity of the panel. So I work for KPMG, a large business transformation organization. I lead in the UK what we call an information sharing practice, predominantly in health, social care, and justice and community safety, where the challenge increasingly is we're trying to, in a time of austerity, deliver better healthcare, or at least the same healthcare, where our funding is increasingly running out. And data and digital is one of the levers, one of the most powerful levers we have to do that. So I certainly bring that lens. I'm a cognitive psychologist by early education, so it's very nice to be part of a conference like this. We have Marina, we'll talk to you in a minute, and she comes from a nonprofit that is focused on thinking about the future, and in particular technology, employment and skills, and that will very much shape the landscape, I think, of this debate. We've followed then by Katie, who works for the MOD and NATO, she's a trained psychologist and a human factors person who will talk to us about maintaining reasonable control over AI and data ourselves. And then last and certainly not least, we have Ramsey at the end, and they'll all tell you about themselves as well. But he's an entrepreneur, a futurologist, a neuroscientist, and a co-founder of a really interesting startup, which he'll tell you about in a moment. So I think we'll have a really interesting blend of perspectives. So I'm going to give you, I think, some parallel examples from the world of health. NATO and the member countries will have a number of really important missions, not least of which is the protecting of democracy and all the rights that are attached to that. I like to think of what I do is driving a very important mission as well, and that's the mission of delivering societal health. And if you think in a democracy, and you'll have perhaps different views about this, but is healthcare a right or isn't it a right? Many of us think healthcare is a right. So one of the things that we try very specifically to do in really challenging times is maintain or improve the health and well-being of our population. And it's a really difficult mission. And data and digital is both an opportunity and a challenge for that. So this is what we colloquially call the jaws of doom. This may make sense to you all, but essentially we exist in a world, certainly in the UK, where demand for services in social care and health is rising, and the supply, both in terms of personnel and skills, but just in budget in near terms, is decreasing. And one of the things that we know that if we don't become creative and use data and use digital to optimize the health of our populations, by definition, our populations are going to be sicker and deader. I know deader is not a real word, but it's a terrible thing to think about. So I'd like to represent it in kind of this form, because that's very much what it can feel like to people that are delivering the face of care. We desperately want to help them as much as possible with digital and with data, of course. So I'll give you an example of that. So I worked in Greater Manchester, which is about 5% of the UK's population. And they know if they don't make changes to the way they deliver care, they'll have a £6 billion funding gap in terms of delivering health and care. And if you just imagine by default, if we don't close that gap, people will very much, they won't even have the same standards of health and care that they have today. I thought it might be interesting too, as we talk about the rise of AI and data, what's really driving that. You might be interested in terms of a parallel sort of mission. What are the trends there? So Client Pathways is very much about channel shift. It's very much about self-service on devices, letting me apply for services at a time that's convenient for me. It increases the time to service. And better interaction. So that definitely, I think, is shaping the world globally. A focus on outcomes is probably the most important and the hardest to me. So increasingly, our health and care systems are trying to develop a capability where they understand, if I do this, this will be the outcome societally in terms of health and care. And I find that measuring outcomes in terms of data and decision science is actually one of the hardest things to do for health and care, and we have a tremendous skill gap there. If we're not able to do that well, we can't actually manage and moderate what we're doing and shift if our investments aren't working. But more importantly, and I'll come on to this in a minute, we can't engage our population from a position of using their data from a point of value to them, which I think is absolutely critical in terms of maintaining democracy, but also maintaining and improving health and care in our digital society. Intergovernmental and intersectoral integration are just increasing collaboration. It's no longer, I'm going to serve you in a health context or a social care context or a justice context. I'm going to serve you, and if I'm going to do that, we need to coordinate and be able to see you holistically across all our member programs and missions. And that's very difficult to do in terms of data. And then intersectoral collaboration is increasingly the rise of public and private sector partnerships. Also difficult to share and exchange data. Last and certainly not least is a real focus on serving and providing data where I live, where you live. The notion is that nobody is going to be able to care for us better than the people that live near us, that are in our communities, that know us better. And they're often ill-served by data. They often can't see us holistically to help us in the way that they want. So why does it matter? It matters because all of these things require data, right? So we have totally different terms now. It's not gigabytes anymore, it's exabytes. I'm sure increasingly. So data is here to stay. What does it mean? So obviously, I think we need to become, and really part of the STRATCOM dialogue is what do we do to prepare ourselves for that? I thought you might also be interested. The other thing is just the pure economic opportunity of data. So this is Dubai. It's quite a different example, but one of the things I love that they've done is they've taken a step back and tried to quantify what would the value of data be to their place, to their economy. And I don't know about you, but I have seen very few examples. This is probably the best one that I've seen of a government stepping back and saying, what is the value? And they actually quantify that just by starting with their publicly governmental data, they can send about 6.4 or so UAE dollars into their economy, and by the end of 2021, by opening up other sources, they can get to just over 10 and a half. So in real terms, that's about 1.8 billion US dollars to 2.8 billion US dollars, and that's just under 1% to 1.2% of their economic contribution, their GDP. So that is another reason that I think data is here to stay, that your conversation and this dialogue is so timely. I thought it would be useful to show you that example because I think the organizations that are better at optimizing their data and their societies are better at optimizing their data will achieve economic efficiencies like this. Economic well-being is either driven by democracy or a contributor to democracy, probably both in equal terms, so that becomes important. I also think societally what's happening to us is really, really interesting. I'm a parent of 2 young children, 2 and 5, and independent of all of this, I worry about how I'll prepare them for a digital world. Don't know for those of you that are parents if you worry about that too. This is a really famous picture by a kind of graffiti artist in the UK, Banksy. Some of you may know him. By the way, if anybody is going to Google mobile lovers, make sure you put Banksy in there because I take no responsibility for what's going to be returned. I don't want to have to explain that after this panel, so just that's my kind of caveat on that. But it's a great picture, and it describes better than anything I've seen what's happening to us as a society. It's a really Casablanca kind of picture, 2 human beings really into one another physically, personally, but when you look a little bit closer, what are they doing? They're looking past one another into their digital devices, into their digital world. And I actually think in an interesting way, that's what's happening to us. And it's hard for us to understand what to do because it's a bit like skiing and doing your taxes. We're the machine that's examining itself, right? We're kind of objectively stepping back and saying, what should we do? But we're in it today. So I'm very interested in that problem, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in that problem too. But it's a very cool piece of art, and if you Google it properly, you can take a look at it. Okay, so I wanted to leave you with just some challenging ideas. I recently met with the last global conference of privacy and data protection commissioners, and they asked me to be really challenging, and I want to challenge you in a similar way around what we might do. So what's government's responsibility for our digital selves? If you think now I have a physical self and I have a digital self, increasingly my government, my society is serving my digital self. Are they best placed to do that? Do they have the right skills? Do I have the right skills, more importantly, to optimize my digital self? So typically, what would the responsibility of government be? To keep us safe, to help us meet our digital selves? Would you go a little bit farther? Would you say government's obligation is to help us optimize our digital self? I personally think that it is. I think the light is coming on around that in health and care. So what do we do today? I mean, it's mostly around, which are really important things, by the way, cyber, security, resilience, self-service and channel shift is important. We're getting to transparency. In a democracy, at least show me what you know about me. And I think a lot of institutions stop there. But should we do more? Is there something about optimizing what I can do and my children can do on the internet in terms of their digital selves? We talked a little bit yesterday. I thought one of the themes was education and early education of society so they can participate with their digital selves in democracy. I absolutely believe that's one of the fundamental things we should be doing as democratic societies. We're not doing enough, and we are skiing and doing our taxes, but that's one of the things we need to start doing more. Okay? So what would you view your role in as the digital age? So, does that idea of optimizing the digital self change any of your thinking? Does it reinforce what you already knew? Be looking forward to Q&A, what you think of this idea. What are you prepared to do as members of an alliance, as partners within that alliance? Is it to kind of monitor and guide, or will you actually weigh in and remediate and teach and educate? What will your role be? How will you foster innovation? Will you engage your populations on how they can use data in new ways? Is that really important? You're doing that already, I think. This is an example of that. Do you fund, privacy and digital engagement initiatives? I think the answer to that's yes. And do you influence new operating models around privacy and sharing? And I think a big flaw in most operating models, at least in health and care, is we do not engage citizens, residents, patients, victims, offenders enough in their care. And we need to get better at that. And we're ill-equipped in terms of social media, in terms of the ability to communicate from a position of value to people why their data matters and why they should let us use it. All of those things are anemic skills, at least in my part of the world, for health and care. So I'll close just with this one question or a few questions, as I say there. So do you know how much your organizations are investing in digital overall? Do you have any idea how much that investment is around engaging citizens on their digital self and optimizing their digital well-being? Any idea at all? My suggestion would be that's an important question to start asking if you don't know, because I don't know what proportional investment will be, but I think you've got to start asking the question of yourselves. And how do you get a proportional contribution in order to help your populations participate in democracy? Understand what fake news is. Guide their children in a democratic way on what's happening. So if you accept, and you may or may not, that governments increasingly interact with the citizen split in two, what does that mean then? Do you have a fundamental right, and you're already, I think, doing a number of things there to help us optimize our digital selves? What does that mean in terms of education, in terms of digital engagement? If you think a digital future is something like in the next 10 years, could be sooner, could be later, this is something that I personally believe it'll be as common for us to check our digital selves online in terms of our data, what it's being used. We'll have personal data stores. We'll be giving consent, both from a commodity economic perspective for people to use our data, but we'll also participate in what we call data charities, where I might, for a social cause, donate my data for research or whatever it might be for the good of the population. So if I'm doing that, and that's as common, and you accept that that is a reasonably near future, how does that change the dialogue today? Does it nuance it at all? Does it offer anything new? And I look forward to your reactions to that. And I think with that, I'm just going to say thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'll invite Marina to come up and talk to you about technology, education, and skills, and how that's shaping our world. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much. Great to be here with you. So at the Institute for the Future, for the past 50 years, we've been focused on trying to understand the interaction of technology and human organization, how the two co-evolve. There's a famous phrase attributed to Marshall McLuhan who said, apparently, we invent our technologies and thereafter our technologies reinvent us. So we're constantly in this process of together innovating around technologies and social organization, how we work, how we live, what does entertainment look like with this new generation of technologies. And in my particular work, I've been really interested in what's happening with work and jobs and the kind of transformations we're going through with the emergence of various kinds of platforms like Uber or DoorDash or all kinds of platforms that seem to be emerging, new one every day. And it's common in Silicon Valley to think about that, oh my gosh, it's my sheer brilliance through which I invented these platforms, I invented these technologies. And we step back and say, really, it's not about Uber on these platforms. What they enable has been built out over many, many decades, probably 30 or 40 years of generations of technologies that enable something like Uber and all these other platforms. So let's unpack what are these technologies that we built over the last 30, 40 years, because each of these generations gives new sort of affordances, allows us to do things in new ways or in different ways, and also in the process creates new opportunities and new challenges. But all these things are additive, and that's what's enabling all these platforms and evolution. So let's go back to 1980s. That's really the emergence of email, the internet, diffusion, all these early communications technologies, right? And what does it allow us? It allows us greater access. So now you can reach people outside of your organization, outside of your geography. You can potentially hire people, engage them in collaborating. So it creates this great access at the level that we've never seen before. So on top of that, what are we adding in 1990s? We're adding mobile technologies and sensors. And sensors are really important, particularly the geolocation sensors. So it's interesting that with all these beyond geographies, what do you do when you first call somebody on your phone, right? What's the first question you ask usually? Where are you, right? Because that's what gives you context. Are you in a conference? Which means you can't probably talk. Are you around? Are you in this location, that location? And we're adding all kinds of additional sensors that allows us greater context, greater understanding who's around you, what might be your needs, even your mood now. But we're adding all these things and we're making them portable and available every time, anytime, any place. And then, of course, once you bring all that data, everything becomes a data and comes with data, it gives you more intelligence. So you can match things, you can allow to deliver things to people who need them at that particular time and in that particular context. And really, that is the infrastructure that we've built that's enabling this new generation of platforms, whether they're Uber or many, many others. And I think we're kind of at the early stages of utilizing all these technologies and redefining what work is and how we do work. Basically, it allows us to do various kinds of things. We call it the economy of digital coordination because it allows us to coordinate and do things in a different way, right? And what it enables us to do is instead of it takes jobs that are maybe 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or whatever they are and divide them into tasks, into smaller bits that basically I can engage anybody in this large network that I have access to with the right skills and right abilities to fulfill those tasks. And most importantly, a lot of that coordination and matching is actually not done by humans. It's done by algorithms. It's done by these programs, right? So if you think about organizations, and the main function of a lot of organizations is coordination for coordination of these various complex scaled activities, we now have a new technology for doing these kinds of things, for accomplishing this kind of coordination. Now, I think of institutions as a kind of technology. It's a social technology. And it's something we didn't always live in large formal organization. It's not something that's preordained. It's something that evolved over time. And it doesn't mean that before we had these technologies, we were sitting around doing nothing. We were creating, we were doing things, but we were doing it on a different scale. And we had different set of technologies available. So we've created over the last probably 100, maybe 200 years, this mechanism for allowing us to conduct these economic activities on a scale that we've never been able to do before. And this is exactly, this particular social technology is in some way being disrupted. We have now a new suite of technologies to do this kind of scaling, to do this kind of coordination. So I don't know if this looks familiar. This is from CDC. This is a kind of technology. This is a org chart. I don't know if it looks familiar. Probably does. We've all lived in these kinds of organizations. This is the best technology we've had for coordinating and getting things done. And now we have these new suites of technologies to do it. So it bypasses some of those hierarchical organizations. It says somebody here needs something and somebody else here has this ability to deliver these things, and APIs are these basically pieces of program that allows you to match those in need with those who has this ability to fulfill the need. And so this is a new technology. This is a new kind of social technology that we're evolving. And increasingly, we're going to be able to do things with this new suite of technologies in a different way. So just to say that it's not just about, sorry, it's not just about Uber. So actually, early on, when everybody was focused on Uber and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we wrote a paper that said it's not about Uber. So this is an example. We created this platform called iCEO. You can read about it in the Harvard Business Review. And basically, it's a platform that applies the same principle of coordination, algorithmic coordination, to knowledge work, to our work as researchers. So we asked ourselves a question. So if you applied the same suite of technologies to research and writing reports and the kind of work we do, what happens? So we created this recipe, basically a piece of technology that allowed you to break up the task of doing a research report into pieces. And we used various kind of crowd platforms like Upwork and TaskRabbit and others. There's probably other ones here in Europe to engage large groups of people in helping us do these tasks. So in the process, what's the first phase of doing research? You look at bibliography. Who else has written something about this topic? So we basically recruited people using some machine learning algorithms, identified people who can do this task on Upwork. And so we created this great bibliography. That was the first part of the recipe. The next part of the recipe was, okay, summarize what are the key points in this research. So we recruited the next batch of people, and they did this kind of work. And then we asked, okay, well then rank. What are the important pieces of this work? And other group of people ranked and curated this work. And at the end of 2 weeks, we had this amazing research report where when I looked at it, I said, we never are doing research the same way again. Because for a small organization, all of a sudden, we were able to reach people who are signed up on Upwork. They were university professors, they were editors from Inc. magazine, and the kind of resources that for us were unimaginable that we would have access to. And so it's an example that it shows us that it's not just about low-skilled work. It's actually these technologies are enabling us to do things in a very, very different way. And I don't think it's about just Uber. It's about all kinds of work that we're reconfiguring and are doing in new ways. And increasingly we'll be able to do that, including kind of sophisticated or what we think high knowledge work. So, and the other thing is that this is kind of the first generation of technologies. Increasingly, we're engaging basically with the Internet of Things, where objects and other things are embedded with connectivity and intelligence and all these same capabilities. Increasingly, machines are going to be negotiating with each other. So think about the self-driving car. If I have a self-driving car and I own it, for example, maybe I can program it that it rents itself out, and maybe it demands the best rates and rents it out using those kind of algorithms, economic algorithms, right? So basically, these objects are creating their own economy, or they're creating economy with us. They're becoming all kind of economy of things. So new tasks and new things we will be able to do with these kinds of technologies. As I said, I think we're at the early stages of this transformation. So all of these things are potentially exciting. They're also potentially scary, and there are risks and challenges involved in these kinds of transformations. So I just wanted to outline some of the things that I see kind of as challenges, something we need to solve for. So we talk about these platforms like Uber, and Facebook is a platform, Google is a platform. A lot of more of our interactions and a lot of our work is increasingly being done through these kinds of platforms. And there are a lot of issues with them. So one of the issues with something like Uber, for example, is that, of course, the drivers, the problem is that these platforms create tremendous economic benefits to investors and the founders of these platforms, but they're not creating the same level of benefits for people who are sustaining their livelihoods on these platforms, including the fact that none of the Uber drivers, not only they don't get any benefits like retirement and pension and all the traditional benefits, but they have no ownership stake in companies, in this platform. They're not owners of these platforms. And if you worked in a company like GM, for example, in 50s and 60s, you were likely also owned stock in GM. So you were an economic participant in that kind of innovation. And so that's an issue here. A lot of work that we've been doing is really looking at what does a positive platform look like? What is a platform that we can develop that works not just for investors and for people who are founders, but also works for people who are basically sustaining their livelihoods from these platforms. Similarly, we all work for Facebook or Google or others. They're capitalizing on our data, right? Are we able to generate some, we're getting tremendous social benefit from it, right? Connectivity, all kinds of other things, but we're not necessarily getting as much economic benefit from it. How do you create, what does a positive platform look like going forward? So that's one issue that's important. The other one, and it's particularly in the US, the issue of the social safety net that in the US in particular was created 1950s when everybody worked in GM and all your benefits and everything was tied to your retirement, your health care, your training. All of these things were basically tied to your employment. That is not the same for Europe, so I do think it's an easier transformation here in many ways, but we need to solve what does the 21st century social safety net look like in this world of platforms. There are a lot of regulatory issues related to that. For example, some of them, just to share, is reputations are very important on these platforms. That's how you get your pay. That's how you get your access to the next gig, to the next job, to the next task. How transparent are these platforms about these reputations? Can people own these reputations? Can they be portable? Can I port my reputation from this platform to the next platform? Who has ownership of all the data that's generated on these platforms? Am I allowed to own this data? All kinds of issues, and in addition to the network effects of these platforms, which easily drive them to become monopolies. So that's a regulatory issue. The other big issue, and I think like that's something that we'll have to grapple with in the next probably decade, is that as people are not attached necessarily to a particular workplace or a firm, so much of how we've kind of found meaning in our lives and community has come with this engagement in full-time employment. That's not just a source of pay, it's a source of community, it's a source of social connections, it's a source of training, all of these things. So how do we, what are the new places where we can find these communities, meaning, and other things for people who are not necessarily working 9-to-5 jobs in formal organizations? And the last thing, we talk about skills. We've done a lot of ethnographic research with people who are working in this on-demand economy, and I can tell you, a lot of skills are needed to be successful in this world of on-demand work, including financial management. People are having trouble figuring out whether they're actually making money on these platforms or not. It actually, you need a lot of financial savvy to be able to be successful on these platforms. Reputation building, being able to collaborate and bring tribes together quickly to accomplish some things. These are not the kind of things we're teaching kids in high school or colleges or other places. This is the learning curve to be successful on these platforms is really steep. So I think these are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. I believe that once these technologies are out of the box, we can't put them back in. That never happens. We can, we can regulate them, we can shape them, and I think our big task is to take advantage of these technologies and shape them so that they create good and social value and solve for some of these challenges. Thank you. Oh. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence. So anyone doing the conference bingo, you can tick that one off. But before I start, I just need to sort of outline my affiliations. So I predominantly work for the Defence Science Technology Laboratory, which is part of the Ministry of Defence. So I'm a civil servant and government employee, which means, amongst things, my slides aren't as whizzy and my presentation isn't as slick as we've seen throughout our industry and academic partners. My role within DSTL is I'm leading a project called Novel Influence Research, and the concept of that is the idea of taking new ideas, new technologies, and things that are currently at low technology readiness and advancing them so that the science becomes usable. In addition to my role there, I also sit as a member on the NATO Human Factors in Medicine Research panel. So that's a panel that convenes under the Science and Technology Organisation that sits within the NATO infrastructure. The idea there is that we bring international experts together to plan a programme of work that helps deliver the science and technology to the front line within NATO. So whilst I'm speaking with both of those roles, I do, as a government employee, just have to point out that I'm talking about my corner of the world and the things that I know about. So I know some similar things were said yesterday. It also means that any difficult questions, I can say, I'm sorry, that's a matter of national security, and I couldn't possibly comment. So when Rolf got in touch and he had this idea of a panel that talks about the loss of free will, can humans stay in charge? I thought, what a brilliant topic and a brilliant title. And the kind of brief that you may have seen within the conference programme is the idea that humans are at the centre. But actually what happens when computers are becoming increasingly powerful and intelligent? And there was the discussions yesterday about free will and what if computers can demonstrate free will? And if we say, well, free will is a choice, what if computers can demonstrate a choice? That future's already here. And that then questions our ability to understand, well, what does that mean to be human? And therefore, how do we relate in this world? So public perception of artificial intelligence, if you ask people about what happens if computers are in charge, it always ends in this sort of dystopian idea that there is no way that we're going to be able to keep in charge of artificial intelligence. And you can see calls from prominent sort of figures that are saying, we need to stop development now, we need to do responsible development. So we see across society and across public that people are very, very worried about artificial intelligence. It's already got that stigma alongside nuclear weapons. If we restrict it, can we prevent those futures? Well, I think everyone would probably agree no. And actually trying to halt technological developments, the pace that it's developing now, those conversations, we need to think about how we can do ethical, use artificial intelligence in the areas that we work in an ethical way. Now, conceptually, the idea of using artificial intelligence in strategic communication, it's not that complicated. We can use it to kind of help us to deal with this big data phenomenon. So we can generate reports with more speed, we can provide insight and analysis to greater depth, and we can optimize campaigns. That doesn't sound like something we ought to be that concerned about. But also, if you take it a little bit further, we can train machines to measure features of our communication and identify what parts of that communication is landing particularly well with our audiences. We can use data science and computational social science or behavioural analytics, whatever people are calling it as they're researching it, that can then help identify those features and build machines to optimise our influence campaigns. We can use natural language processing to translate human communication into a computer language. And that's where the technology pushes us a little bit further, because that means that we can actually use machines to generate content. So if we can consider emotionally aware artificial intelligence in a communications environment, we're talking here really about chatbots and social robots and capable of monitoring and measuring emotion and responding, which means that we're talking about emotionally aware agents that are demonstrating free choice. So you can see how the idea goes from something relatively benign, a technology that's assisting us with this big data issue, to something that runs away into an independent thinking capable of emotional manipulation and putting out and generating content that is contributing to this contested environment. And the questions there really sort of concern, well, if it's independent and thinking for itself, and if they're working together, as we've seen computers being able to machine learning algorithms so that they can bounce ideas off each other and develop, where do their allegiances really lie? And where is the human control? These sorts of questions can't be thought about later. So what happens, and this is what was really exciting about the question that was put to us, where are those loyalties? If it's evolving, is it even possible that humans can stay in charge of these technologies? And I haven't got the answer to that, but I will say that we really have to. So we have to make sure that the things that we develop, we are able to control. The idea that technology could make its own decisions and function within a military environment without any human oversight is considered widely unacceptable. But work conducted by the NATO Multinational Capability Development Campaign really sort of brings home the fact that AI is growing in the military sphere. It's going to be a permanent feature. And it's appropriate that AI remains under appropriate human control, so that we need to maintain that control. Which is fine to say, but what does that actually mean? What is appropriate human control within a strategic communication environment? So it's really complex, and I liked the discussions yesterday where people were really approaching multidisciplinary problems, solutions to these complex problems, because I heard people say, well, law alone can't solve this problem, psychology alone can't solve this problem, data science alone can't solve this problem. The idea that we can provide indicators and warnings, so something flashes up and says, your computer is suggesting we take this action, and then you respond to that button, you can either authorize or decline the release of a message. That's not really sufficient human control, because if there's no cognitive awareness and sort of understanding of what that indicator and warning means and what that response might be, then that's not sufficient. It means that humans are going to need to be able to drill down on demand and actually understand the concept that we're investigating. Now, a lot of this, these theories developed in response to aviation, which I know is hugely complex, and I know very little about aviation, but I do know a very little about humans and psychology. And I'd struggle to see anything more complex than understanding the consequences in the environments of human behaviour, action, communication. So whilst it's come out of this idea that it's an lethal autonomous weapon systems, it can still be applied to the strategic communication environment. The core tenets of what meaningful human control means is that it should be predictable, which is reasonable. It should be reliable and not just fail in one go, but be designed so that you can recognize failures as you go. And it should be transparent so that you can interrogate it. These are key parameters that we would expect technology so that we know that it's behaving in a way that it ought to. But it's not just the technology, it's the users, and that's what the challenges that I sort of put to the audience here really are, because the users are central to strategic communication. They must have accurate information, and we know how hard that is. They must understand the outcomes being sought, understand the technology and its process, and understand the context in which the technology will function. That's Nobel Peace Prize winning stuff if you understand all of that and how you can communicate in an environment and how the technology contributes. We don't currently know how traditional communication works in all of those factors. So research is needed not just in artificial intelligence. We can't think that that's the solution. We need to understand our users, and particularly our military users, who most military users will not have done a first degree in data science and a second degree in psychology and a third degree in technology before military. Although I know I've seen some very, very intelligent military users who are very good at doing that, your regular operator would not be able to do that. And then it becomes more complex from the accountability side. When we talk about artificial intelligence and computers making decisions, we need somebody to be accountable, and it needs to be a human. Which means that there has to be, if you're going to be accountable, there needs to be timely human action. And we're talking about an environment where the context is shifting rapidly. So you need to be able to recognize and respond in an appropriate fashion in order to be able to be held accountable. And you also need the capacity to be able to intervene. So if you are, a kind of summary is that if you are capable of action, or if no action or inaction occurs, then you are accountable. And you can see why this sort of conjures up ideas of risk, that you're in a world operating with technology and end users that you can't predict, and we're asking a single person, a single commander, to treat this as a subordinate system for which they're accountable of second and third order effects, of which they're unaware. That not sure anyone seeking promotion is going to stand up and do, I'll do that job, that'll be fine. You know, I can't imagine it going wrong. So what we're doing within NATO, there's a research activity that just got endorsed at the last meeting in April, and it's entitled Meaningful Human Control. What that's going to do, so at the moment we have 4 nations, so we have the Netherlands, Germany, the US and the UK. They will form an exploratory team, and they'll be brought together to help look at what the definitions might be. Within their scope, they're going to look at things of observability, so what information should be made available, predictability, so how they can be designed, and directability, so at what level of abstraction should a human have control. This group will meet later in the year, and I wanted to mention it because it's a NATO activity. We have 4 nations involved, but we want wide representation. So if you're interested in getting involved and learning more about the meeting, it's not taken place. And so I would encourage you, if you could pop up after this or get in touch with my contact details, and I can put you in touch with the people who are leading this. Within the UK, so the Novel Influence Research Programme, in our vision of using AI, we will only look at where it augments human performance. So we're looking at where it can reduce cognitive burden, where it can deal with large amounts of information, potentially where it can help identify the truth in open source information, and where it can identify disinformation. And we're going to continue our work in advancing the idea of behavioural analytics, so algorithm development to help us move forward some of the understanding of the principles that underlie these technologies. Later in the summer, we'll be formally announcing, so this is the sneak peek of a 5 million call that we'll be putting out through, it's called the Defence and Security Accelerator. That's money that we will announce as a themed call, and we look for industry and academic partners to bid into that pot with their ideas, and then we will fund to take them out of a proof of concept into something that we can then understand if it has relevance. So again, I really encourage, if you're interested in learning more about that, to make contact. So, can we stay in charge? I really hope that we can stay in charge. I remain sceptical because I'm a psychologist, and that's kind of part of the profession, that AI will ever be able to achieve sort of true independent thought. But the idea of computers demonstrating what can loosely be spoken of as free will is that's the future we're in now. When it comes to self-awareness and emotion, the complicated physiology and psychology of humans, I hope not, and I hope that we maintain that control. We do need to invest in understanding and governance to make sure that we get this right, and we do develop artificial intelligence solutions to STRATCOM in an ethically and moral way. But at the same time, we need to recognise that peer and near-peer adversaries are investing in this technology. If we delay too far looking at the governance, then we're going to miss opportunities to use technology now. So we need to do a lot as a community to debunk some of the myths around AI and the perceptions that we're all heading towards a dystopian future. We need to make sure we have the early adoption of technologies, but we do so fully cognizant of the risks and within a framework of meaningful human control. So it should provide that starting point for before we go full steam ahead down an AI STRATCOM route, that we need to recognise that all of us, from whatever discipline we represent and from whichever military areas that we work within, that we all have a part to play in making sure that there is safe, ethical adoption of the technologies that we see being presented to us. And so please do, if you would like to find out more about the exploratory team, we have a symposium in October on human autonomy teaming, where we'll have some concept demonstrators, and specifically on the issue of trust. And if you'd like to find out more about, if you've got a bright idea that contributes to the area and you're looking for funding to advance that, that's something that the UK would be particularly interested in hearing about. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ramsey Brown. I'm the co-founder and chief operations officer of Boundless Mind, technology startup from Venice, California. So Riga's a little far from home for me. but I'd like to thank you all for having me here and thank my girlfriend and grandmother and mom for staying up till midnight to watch this live stream. When we think about the loss of free will and whether or not humans can stay in charge, it feels like we've done an a priori that humans had free will to begin with. And I'm not going to try to make a stance on this immediately, but as a conversational prop, I'm going to pull in one of my intellectual forefathers, Burrhus Frederick Skinner, a Harvard academic, who was the radical behavioral scientist who pioneered behaviorism, along with the work of Olds and Milner and other of his colleagues. If Skinner is remembered not just for his controversial science, he's remembered for his extremely controversial thoughts around philosophy, especially around the role of human free will and autonomy, as he laid out for us in his seminal work, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. From this perspective of understanding what he'd seen in behaviorism, where the animal, human included, guides its behavior through stimuli it receives from its internal and external environment, free will seemed like a bit of an odd thing to him. We are these machines shaped by our genes, what we sense inside of ourselves, and what we sense in our external world. We remember Skinner for the work he did on pigeons as his model system, by which he pioneered operant conditioning and understanding why it is that pain and pleasure, especially pleasure, for all the talk about dopamine from yesterday's neuroeconomists, why should it be that reinforcement, positivity, that little burst of dopamine, shapes our behavior? While he worked on pigeons, we see ourselves today caught in Skinner boxes of our own design. We are the pigeons in our systems. I think this is extremely pertinent for strategic communications. And as we go from pigeons to people, I understand that from the academic neuroscience perspective, of which I had the pleasure of training at University of Southern California for a little while, there's some assumptions I get to make about why it's intuitive that we can say things about pigeons' behavior or rats' behavior and why they mean something to humans, but I don't want to make some assumptions as an academic about what everyone else knows as well. What you're seeing above is a flattened out schematic representation of the architecture of the central nervous system. Imagine this like unfurling the brain and laying it flat. This is the pioneering work of Dr. Larry Swanson, my close friend and personal and academic mentor, that he pioneered in the 80s, 90s, and through to today. The red lines you see are the structural connectivity we find in the central nervous system, the major axon pathways that are the conduits of information. Think of these as the highways of information that the brain uses to do the computations it's performing to guide your behavior. Below it, we see the same type of map, one for the rat and one for the human. And what I'd like to call attention to is that nothing has really changed in this structural plan other than the proportional representational surface area. Humans have much more cortex here in pink, proportional to the size of our brainstem and our spinal cord. Rats are a little more proportionally representative to each other. Though the differences are there, and these differences account for why I'm giving this talk and a rat isn't, the same underlying wiring that guides our behavior, especially our response to the context of our environment, remains consistent and is testament to our shared genetic heritability. Leaving academia and entering California enterprise software scene and artificial intelligence, my close friend and co-founder, Dr. Thomas Combs, and I recently published a book that I'm actually making available for free to all conference participants. They'll find a way to get you the link or something. That we have seen from the systems neuroscience perspective, from the artificial intelligence perspective, we now can discuss a rigorous technology of human behavior, which now allows us to do design against it. Where strategic communications has previously been about arranging text or arranging text in picture or arranging text in moving picture and sound bite as to influence what happens on the international stage, what I propose to you today is that we are entering a rigorous technology of human behavior, which means that from the strategic communications perspective, human behavior and human motivation states are now a core building block with which you can design policy around. What you'll find in this book, this brief pitch for it, is a brief introduction to 12 tools that we and others in the field have identified by which you can increase, decrease, or modify the frequency of different types of human behaviors, especially in digital contexts. Everyone who's taking their smartphone, I took a picture of this, literally you're going to get the PDF. It's okay. The one I'd like to speak with you about today is this idea of variable reinforcement, because it so well dovetails with why we see both the global rise of what people call smartphone addiction, a misplaced relationship with their technology, but also because I think it has the most external validity. It's what my team and I have worked on and what our artificial intelligence uses to persuade people to behave differently. And it's what I think has a lot of pertinent to what STRATCOM is about. In what we call the CAR model, a cue, action, and reward model, people are triggered to start a behavior from a cue they receive from their internal environment, what they feel or think, from their external environment, the smell of donuts over there, or from a synthetic cue, maybe something that a developer or a behavioral designer has placed in their path through some sort of smartphone technology. Then they take an action. There's a thing we would like them to do. And then sometimes, but not every time, they are reinforced for this. This is the critical piece that turns out was the pioneering work of Skinner, that when we do not see the reinforcement coming, it is more likely to increase our future frequency of that behavior. It turns out this variability is wicked hard to get right mathematically. But we were able to do it today. And my team and I look at 4 major trends over the past decade, which is why I can stand in front of you here today and talk about this, and I couldn't a decade ago. The first is that now, for the first time, especially globally, and not just in the post-industrial world, but increasingly the emerging world, overwhelming amount of people are now carrying a omnipresent, always on, always connected supercomputer on their hip at all times. It is sensing their behavior. It is sensing its context. It is sensing their motivational states, where they are, what they're doing, how much they're moving, what they're saying. We're getting increasingly good at systems neuroscience. And while neuroscience has a lot of questions it still needs to answer, ranging from what's underneath depression and Alzheimer's and schizophrenia, to how we use those to increase longevity of populations worldwide, neuroscience has gotten right a few things in the past 10 years, largely through advances in artificial intelligence, and specifically around motivated behavior. Why do we do what we do when it comes to our wants, needs, and how reinforcement shapes those? A lot of recent advances have shed a lot of light there and made it easier to build these types of technologies. The advent of cloud computing has made storage and computing stupid cheap. So what used to take millions of dollars to store or transmit or properly process now can be done by California startups in a garage for pennies on the dollar. And finally, artificial intelligence has now gotten easy enough to work with that an intrepid set of millennials with some elbow grease and a little bit of venture backing can build a system that globally shapes human behavior and wants and needs. This is largely because of a relationship between academia and industry over the past 10 years, in which a lot of people who have been in computer science facilities working at universities have built open source packages. A lot of people at Google and Apple and Microsoft have contributed, and now it's extremely easy to get started very quickly building really advanced predictors or pattern recognizers. These 4 forces converge to mean now I have a machine that is always listening to what I'm doing. Well, mine's sitting over there. You want to have a machine that's always listening to what you're doing, can communicate to the net lickety-split, can store it indefinitely, can compute against it, understands human motivational states at a model level, and has the ability to predict how small interventions into your digital context can shape your future behavior predictively. This is what my team and I do at Boundless Mind. So we run a plug-it-in-and-go behavioral engineering service available globally that allows any piece of technology to increase the future frequency of behavior that someone will perform an action. Consider this the industry practitioner version of what we heard from the neuroeconomists yesterday. We've shown this effective in healthcare, in gaming, in fitness and wellness, in social media contexts, e-commerce, productivity, financial services, and education. I started out life a very, very curious child, learned to code when I was a kid, thought I would grow up and be a physician. God bless my parents who are physicians. I'm clearly not cut out to be a physician. But the idea of being able to build a thing that would have a bit of a global impact and be able to increase the quality of human welfare, and now increasingly in the strategic communications world, is extremely important to my team and I. I'd like to share with you 2 examples of what we've been able to do using this type of technology as a bit of a seed for you going back to your representative institutions to see this is now what the stakes are for changing and persuading how people behave, not just in the laboratory, but in real life. It is the case that there is a growing wave of negativity online, not just in the political sphere, but especially amongst young people. A customer of ours was interested in a key performance indicator for their business of increasing how frequently people were combating cyberbullying inside of one of their smartphone apps. And by working with them to find an action, like sending a positive message to another one of their friends anonymously, we were able to reinforce it here with selectively showing and hiding a series of motivational quotes shown here in fuchsia. Note that we didn't bribe them. We didn't give them $10. We didn't offer them a Lamborghini. by just very carefully and predictably controlling when and how they were made to feel a little bit better than baseline, we were able to drastically increase the frequency of how often people would come back to this app and spread positivity. From the STRATCOM perspective then, what might it mean to have this type of capacity to then go and in real time and person to person shape how they're responding to rhetoric, shape how they're responding to news, and persuade and encourage them through these uses of positivity for the types of behaviors that are strategically aligned. Increasing financial solvency and the ability to have a thriving financial life worldwide is a goal, of course, and that's felt nowhere more than in sub-Saharan Africa, where fortunately, because of advances in their technology, they've leapfrogged a lot of landline technologies, and the majority of their banking person-to-person is conducted over their mobile phones, their feature phones even. Through the company Tala, known as Mpoko in Kenya, we were able to show a 14% improvement in how often people would pay back microloans early, just by releasing, at very careful timing and variable ratio, when and how the system would thank them positively beyond just a neutral acknowledgement of the receipt of their payment. From this perspective then, when we think about the types of things that NATO would be interested in, or that governments who are member agencies or member states would be interested in, how might we shape how people are contributing in online conversations, given that we now have a powerful, rigorous technology for influencing and persuading people to do the things we would like them to do? How might this consider how they respond to what we can clearly identify as fake news, or as we are trying to transition out of there being ambiguity about the status of news as being verifiable or not, and into a world where people already automatically have the habit of doing a sort of sense check on whether or not this is true? How do we instill that habit? How might variable reinforcement and optimized persuasive AI engender that kind of change to get people to start checking to see if something was true or not? How does this shape what the future of warfare looks like, to the extent that one of the greater global trends in warfare over the past 1,000 years has been the decrease in mortality through a better control of behavior and precision? How does this work with things like human trafficking or sexual trafficking, in which we're looking at some of the remaining tasks globally on Western consensus and liberal democratic values, that we can better understand and predictively change how people are responding to what they see in their community? These are all behaviors, amongst many more, that states are interested in. And what I propose to you today is that we are entering now an era of a technology of behavior. This is becoming as much a design task as in previous generations finding the right words and pictures was for propaganda. Only now it's personalized and predictive for each person uniquely. Though it does not come without a word of caution. Who here has read the book on the right? Who here has read the book on the left? That's usually the ratio we get. In America, at least, every young person is made to read Orwell, is made to read Huxley, though the Huxley we read is not Island, but rather Brave New World. And it's a shame, because it's clear now that we're not going as much, at least in the West, towards a Orwellian dystopia as maybe we're going towards a Huxleyan dystopia, though Huxley cannot be remembered just for being a dystopian author. Island was his book of utopia, in which the same techniques of mass surveillance, the same techniques of persuasion, the same techniques of the use of mind-altering substances to have better spirituality, all of these things that were used to suppress the human condition in Brave New World, instead were used to uplift the human condition and encourage human flourishing in Island. My message for you here today is that we are entering this world of a technology of behavior. My challenge to you is to make sure that we end up at the Island and not in Brave New World. You are NATO. You have the asymmetrical just use of force. You have a lot at stake here, and you can do it. We need to make sure together how, as we look at a behavior that can be engineered, members of institutions like mine, or like Marina's, who operate perhaps in the private sector, can act as allies to enhance these types of goals and make sure we end up at something closer to the Island than a Brave New World. And I will say that the states who start doing this first, and the agencies and organizations that start doing this first, will exhibit a bit of first mover advantage. What this means ethically then is, as we move forward, there's a challenge to make sure we can innovate quickly here, make sure we can align this strategically with what the goals of STRATCOM may be, to enable this better sense of getting towards what we need out of Western democracy and the Western consensus. Because if we don't move quickly, the parties for whom we find ourselves competing with our adversarial may move as well, because you cannot put this knowledge back in boxes. And I'm not the only person who knows this. We're not the only conference talking about this. But it is my goal to be able to share with you that we have a lot of optimism, that we can use these for good, that we can use these to encourage the types of human flourishing. And I'm very excited to explore that future with you. So thank you very much.
Okay, I think I'm back on. Thanks everybody for listening, and thanks to Marina and Katie and Ramsey. Thoroughly enjoyed that. That seemed to go well, least which because I managed not to trip Ramsey, who's the most mobile of our panelists, as he was going back and forth. So that's always a good thing. It was a near thing there for a minute. Don't know if you noticed. But just to quickly do a canter through. So I hope one of the things we delivered was the kind of variability of our perspective. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us, we're not necessarily a group of people, although we're lovely people that would have chosen one another or bumped into one another. And we've had a really interesting set of conversations and some fun over the last couple of days preparing for this and imagining what you would think and how you would react to what we would share with you today. So we're on to the questions, and I think regardless of if we've said something that you want to challenge, if you've said something that perhaps reinforces something that you're already undertaken, or you just have a question and you want to explore something further that we've shared, I hope you've had a really interesting experience. It's a big responsibility after the success of yesterday to relaunch the day, and we applaud you for being here because Riga is an absolutely fabulous city at day and at night. So I think with that, I'd like to go ahead and take your questions. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on what we've had to share.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Preston. I'm associated with the Centre for STRATCOMs at King's College. I have a question for Marina. You're talking about Facebook and data and so on. Do you have a view on the kind of barter economy where we're bartering, in a sense, our own data for access to those platforms?
Right. I think that's a big conversation. One of the things we talk about is data as an asset. And, over time, we've used different assets to generate incomes. Before the financial markets, it was land. Now it's financial resources. So data increasingly is a source, is an asset that we need to think about. There are various types of kind of regimes that are possible, and health is actually a great example. So one possible idea is that, okay, what if you owned your own portfolio of data that you were basically free to monetize in some way or trade in some way? So there is a kind of and I think you need to be looking at different types of data because there's a lot of potential in kind of creating public asset and public good out of some data. So you may not want people to be able to hoard some of the data, and some of it, like some of the city data, for example, you can make the services better, some of the health data. So there's a kind of a public good aspect to it. But some data, yes, you may want to keep that data and own and manage your own portfolio of data. So I think that's a very important conversation, the data regimes that we need to put in place. There are some startups now that are actually creating these kind of caches where you can encrypt your data, they'll encrypt it for you, and then you can trade them for various things. So one approach is this kind of private ownership of data. It was interesting to see the data from Dubai about, I've been trying to look at, has anybody estimated what is the value of that data? I would love to dig into that because it's not clear what the value is and how much of that people can generate, how much income. But my view is that it depends on what kind of data, and we might need to have different kinds of regimes for different data. And of course, it's also, I think Katie and maybe you said that it depends on kind of the social constraints and kind of cultural constraints around it. Different places may have different sort of values around this kind of data and what kind of regime. But definitely one is private ownership, the other one is really public of some sort, regulated. Yeah. You might want to add to both.
I mean, just as an aside, I think it's already happening. I think we're not aware as a population, that we're commoditizing our data and bartering it for good. We're almost doing it in a fog. So I think we need to become more. And so an example, in the UK, I have to retest for my driver's license, me and the other 15-year-olds across the United Kingdom. So it's a very humbling experience. And in order to validate my identity, to apply for that process, I went through a service that the government digital service offers, and I chose an information broker. There are a number of them, Experian, the post office, a number of private sector companies who, in return for the use of my data, validate my identity to the driver's license and motor vehicles agency, who in turn then grants me the right to go ahead and apply for my driver's license. So I'm commoditizing and bartering my data there in terms of for the convenience of identity verification, and I'm sure that those organizations are being compensated for that. So models already exist where that's happening, but as I say, it's kind of happening in a fog all around us. Thoughts? Other questions? That was a good one. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark Leahy, SHAPE Communications Director. Two questions, if I may. The first one to Ramsey. I was peripherally involved with a lady called Mitzi McFate, who was involved in the human terrain system, which was condemned continually by the American Anthropological Society, and in the end died because of the rooted objection of academics and anthropologists in particular working with the military. So I'd like to say from my side of the fence, one of the problems you have working with the civilian side of the fence is a misunderstanding of the military and actually an assumption that we're all evil people with horns. And, you know, you talked about the alliance, and I wonder if you'd like to say about that kind of communication, because I think it's a real problem. You want to work with us, lots of people don't want to work with us. Second question, very interesting things. I get involved in information environment analysis, and there's three kinds of people involved in information analysis. There's a very, very small number of practitioners who understand it, one or two. There's a somewhat larger group of people who don't understand it, admit it, and there's a very large group of people who don't understand it but think they do. And I think there's a major problem with all this AI stuff, is how you train us. As a communicator, my biggest problem is training, is having trained personnel. And it's hard enough training people to do STRATCOM. To do this stuff is another level. And I wonder if you could address this issue, not of training you, but of training us. Thank you.
Sure, I'll take mine first. And Mark, after your stunning participation yesterday in almost every panel with good questions, I was hoping I get to check it off that I got asked a question by you, so thank you. Feels like that was the last box on my bingo. And it's a very good question. So we were talking about this actually on our walk over through Old Town this morning. We had the pleasure of all being posted up at the Radisson. The extent to which one gets to wield soft power means one doesn't have to wield hard power. And there exist a lot of things that the Alliance member states want out of the direction of humanity that are intrinsically about human flourishing, that if we can do soft power and STRATCOM right, it lowers the frequency by which we have to actually use hard power. From that perspective, it seems counterintuitive to me that someone would look at cooperating with these types of organizations as just only about the use of hard power, because hard power is only brought in as to ensure the types of things that we all want here. To be able to admit that we can use soft power techniques working with these types of organizations ahead of time means that my cooperation there actually may decrease the future probability of having to use hard power. And if I truly love peace, it sounds like I'm under a good incentive then to cooperate and collaborate with these types of organizations. I know that might not be a common view, but it seems intuitive. So thank you, it was a good question.
Okay. Anybody want to take the second question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the question around training, because that's one of my key points, is that it's the humans that need to maintain the control, and it's the humans that need to have the awareness, and by that I mean the operators. And I do agree with your assessment on information environment, people working and their level of understanding. I think part of the problem is that we try and train people to understand the whole context and the environment, whereas really we need to focus on research methods and understanding how you study this phenomenon, not let's look at a particular environment, let's look at a particular communication campaign or a narrative, and let's try and control everything. And not to take it too philosophical, but it's a discussion of ontology. A lot of people approach the information environment thinking there's a reality within it that they need to find, and that's why they're assessing it. That this is a large component of social science. It's about having the right research methods, and if we put training into our military operators so that they understand the constraints of human behaviour, what you can measure. You hear a lot of people say, well, we can only do correlation, we can't do causation, and see it as more of an art. But there is a real science behind behavioural science, surprisingly. But that comes new to people. And yesterday I was seeing some Psychology 101 being put up, and people are unaware of some of these experiments. So I think maybe the training is a challenge, but maybe the way that we're looking at it globally is not, let's try and train for a particular scenario, let's try and train a toolkit to ask critical thinking and the right questions.
Great. Fantastic. Other questions out there? That's great. Well, quite a few. So the gentleman here in the middle. And
thank you for the great panel you are having. My name is Vesa Häkkinen. I come from the MFA of Finland. Katie, you were talking about feelings, and I mean, you don't think that the artificial intelligence can ever create some kind of a let's say feeling-based power, as we see in the platforms, in the social media like Facebook and Twitter. The power lies in the emotions and feelings which are delivered by individuals. Do you see any perspective, anyways, on these platforms that the artificial intelligence might get into this field? In the feeling and empowering, let's say, messaging. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to answer that one, and I will caveat when I say that I can't see AI being capable of emotion. I think that's maybe just hopeful thinking, because it's a very important belief to ourselves, and that's the free will. Do we have it or not? As you started, that's a whole discussion in itself. The ability to recognize an emotion within data and the ability to respond with an appropriate response emotion is feasible and possible. Whether or not that's true independent thought, so you can train to recognize maybe a angry response within text, and then maybe decide that maybe another angry response, probably better to do a conciliatory response. That's sort of a simple algorithmic development. So I don't believe that AI could truly independent thought without that programming. It won't be essentially feeling, but it's a philosophical part. And that's where I think the fear of AI comes from, because whether or not we have free will, or if we're all just responding to these cues, I think it is possible that we will have emotional AI, and I think there are evidence of that already. So I think that potentially answers some of that question.
If I may, it's a fantastic question, but there's a really important caveat that always must be discussed when we're having public conversations about artificial intelligence. As we use the term, it's kind of a catch-all for many of the things that we are doing in computing today. In the words of John Kay, one of the fathers of artificial intelligence can be broadly defined as, and I'll butcher this quote a little, any of the cognitive things that humans do that a machine can replicate. Now, whether it does it through simulated neurons, as the EPLP and Lausanne is working on, the Blue Brain project, to literally simulate human consciousness in a simulated brain with simulated neurons on supercomputers, for which they are certainly betting the farm they can actually simulate artificial intelligence by making whole brains digitally. Or it's through just sequences of steps that mimic what humans do, even though it doesn't resemble how a mind is built whatsoever. We call all of this AI, and going from these predictors and pattern recognizers, analyzers, to what we'd consider good old-fashioned hard AI, something that weeps and prays and writes poems, though might not be made of carbon atoms like us. And at least from the computational neuroscience perspective, we're at least certainly trying to see if we can't make a machine that could do all of these things, including feeling, that humans do. And there's been exciting work in the past decade, actually, at what we'd call embodied cognition or embodied artificial intelligence that seeks to basically simulate a body for AI to live in because it gives it things like gut reasoning and better decision making, because it turns out that's what we need to do these things. When you say the words trust your gut, it's not just a colloquialism. There's actually a set of complex computations happening inside your brain to your body. So we are making good strides here. So I think it is not just a perhaps, but a inevitably we will have machines that, if they do not do emotion the way we do emotion, they will appear to do it indistinguishable from us. And from the empathy perspective, then, it might behoove us to treat them as if they were having emotions indistinguishable from our own.
Marina, did you want to?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that as more and more of this information and more communication is happening online, platforms are actually hiring more and more human moderators to filter, because obviously AI cannot pick up everything. And it seems like they're planning to continue doing this, and some of the failures that we've seen in platforms is that they haven't had to do that kind of curation that only humans can do. So I don't know, yes, maybe way out there in the future, these human functions can be replaced, but I don't see that happening. I see the platforms requiring more and more human moderation. And by the way, it's an incredibly stressful job. Like, you really lose faith in humanity if you keep doing it for a couple of months, and that's why people are suffering from PTSD. There's all kinds of things that are happening, but that kind of, I think, as more and more of these communications, we're doing more of that, will require more and more human intervention in them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I think I saw two hands over here. There's one in the back, and then unconventionally, Marina also has a question for Ramsey. So we're going to shake things up over here. We'll see in the time allotted how many we can get to, but I think you guys in the middle were first. Yeah.
Hello, I am Jia Hui from the Ministry of Defense in Singapore. Thank you for the wonderful sharing and insights that you have given us. I have a rather practical question for the panel. Dr. Woodward, you mentioned that research methods on election campaigns and STRATCOMs are actually a bit of essentially research on how humans behave in society. What do you think are the key skills needed for such a timely and relevant research onto these kind of elections? Because we often see ourselves being surprised by new technologies, AI, and we're often catching up and reacting to things rather than being able to predict things. Yeah, thanks.
Wow, good question, which is always the answer when you think, right, how am I going to answer that? And that's going to give me another minute or two. So I think, not entirely sure. So because of the fact that we have to be so reactive to things, being able to fully predict outcomes, you see the success of polling behavior, if you're saying about how can we provide analysis like behavioral analytics to predict the future and use all of this data, then I would say that is massively complex. But using traditional psychology and statistical methods, we can try and identify some of the factors that would help to predict, but never with sort of full certainty, given the complexity here. So I think if you're sort of asking about how do we research sort of outcomes of polls and elections within a rapidly changing environment, I'm afraid I don't have an answer that could do that justice. I don't know if anybody else either here or in the audience may.
Yeah, I mean, only in parallel, I would say, in health, when I showed you the supply and demand paradox, bending the service curve forward towards prevention is absolutely key to closing that funding gap, and getting data to be able to do that is key. Probably our largest barrier is not technology, it's regulation and right to privacy to do that, and that's a societal debate. So I think there are other forces, not just the pace of technology, that make your question a good one and a challenging one to answer. Shall we go to the next questioner? Just here in the middle, and then there, if we can.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Tannehill from the U.S. Embassy in Riga. And so my question is for the panel more generally. as internet and data users become younger and younger and comprise a larger percentage of users, my question would be, how do you regulate the data consumption and the usage whenever these people are too young to be well informed and also fall outside of coverage of the legal apparatus?
That's an outstanding question. No, I think about this one a ton. So I'll do this by analogy here. Facebook released Facebook Messenger for kids, and YouTube has released YouTube for kids, in which what they mostly tried to regulate was content. What would be the types of content that children would have access to, because they viewed that as part of their protection role. What I think we're going to see if this goes right, and part of the role my team and I would like to play, is that we view not only the content as what needs to be modified for protected groups like children, but the interaction patterns. Should it be allowable, either at a cultural norm level or at some sort of industry self-regulation level, because I really don't want to bring the state into this, that children have access to an infinitely scrolling feed, which is highly correlate with being able to use it almost indefinitely. It should be questions like this. How do we introduce friction again into these apps for young people as to, in some form of almost trying to avoid heavy-handed libertarian paternalism, keep it such that it would be harder for them to develop an unhealthy relationship with this technology? That would be my biggest thing. Is how do we strategically introduce friction again in these experiences? And should that burden fall on consumers or on the technology producers? And my intuition is it should fall on teams like Facebook or Google, who are technology producers.
Or sometimes on hardware manufacturers.
Or the hardware, yes, absolutely. And
like
the
Apple's and others.
And so,
because there are levels you can control at the hardware level.
Totally. And now for both Apple and Google, there are digital wellness platforms that they're releasing, which are trying to take these a little more seriously.
I mean, for me, I'd offer, I suppose, I think for the young, and I love Katie's expression around the kind of meaningful human control, the kind of, what was it, graceful degradation in the face of malfunction. If that's not a metaphor for aging, I don't know what is. But I think for the young, their social networks are self-enforcing and self-regulating. And I remember from being a teenager how influenced I was by my peers. So I go back to education. I go back to creating a set of common values in terms of data and data use, and somehow trying to drive it into the networks of the, I'm not that old, but the young, I'll say, kind of. To me, that's key. I would love one day to see something I think a lot about, documents and human thinking that have changed us. So the Magna Carta changed a lot of things. You know, could we have a data carta that we use to regulate, you know, not to be too cute about it, but how we behave, whether we're old or young, on the internet? We don't have that today. And I wonder if we will arrive at that one day. So some more time. Great question. Thank you. There is a gentleman in the back. Can I acknowledge you and take your question, and at least one more over here, and then we might make that do.
My name is Jan Segers. I'm a former Latvian ambassador to NATO. Sorry. My question goes to the issue of emotions. And it seems to me that if, as Mr. Brown said, you know, the computers, artificial intelligence replicate the human mind, right? Is that what you were saying, as I understand it? Ability to replicate?
Go on. Yeah.
Okay. Then what do you do about Kahneman's heuristics and biases?
So
that's one question, sorry. What do you do about Kahneman's heuristics and bias? Because as you know, he said heuristics work very well, but they can really screw up as well. Mm-hmm. The other issue is the question of your reference to Skinner. Mm. And if you remember, I'm old enough to remember the debate that he had with Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky said Skinner is just a form of reductionism. Mm-hmm. And you pointed out it very well, the similarity between the rat and the human mind. And the question is, in 1984, you really have the rat as the human being able to be manipulated into behaving in a certain way. Now the question is, how do you get to the island? And it seems to me what you're saying basically is that you can manipulate the rat man to be positive instead of negative. Am I correct?
These are fantastic questions. Thank you. We'll do them one and then the second. They share a commonality, so we'll address this right now. Of the distinction between the mind and the brain, the mind being this process generative from the neural architecture that is the organ of the brain. On that first note for Kahneman and cognitive biases are things that emerge as an artifact of the structure of human cognition, which emerges from the structure of the human brain. Now, one could envision a set of thinking apparatuses that, because they were not built the way brains are built, they might not have the same emergent biases that brains do. They may, however, exhibit other types of biases. So depending on the structural architecture of these types of thinking machines, we should expect either analogous or dissimilar types of biases, but there should be biases there. These are just heuristics. They're going to be emergent second and tertiary properties that happen that we did not particularly want. And we're already beginning to see these in a lot of the debates about how AI, when not properly controlled, can exacerbate the biases we program into it. So you're absolutely right. Those will exist, and they do exist today. It's going to be important for us to safeguard them. The second question, again, reaches back to the difference between a brain and a mind. I was not as trying to propose that a rat and a human share a similar mind, but we share a conserved architecture in the structure of our brains. Again, here this explains why we have similar behavioral states at times, but we cannot really ask a rat what its mind is shaped like, to the extent that we can even ask another human what their mind is shaped like. We can only observe their behavior and then try to make some inferences about the state of their mind internally. So I would not propose rats and humans share similar minds, but rather have analogous wiring patterns and architectural motifs in the structures of their brains that give rise to similar patterns of behavior. And how this relates then back to Huxley and Orwell is both Huxley and Orwell presciently, for the generation they were writing in, looked at what they could observe not at the advents of psychology and Skinner in the 60s, but rather from what society was being shaped like even earlier, and saw persuasion and control and saw man as an implement of the state here. For both of these, yes, what I am proposing is that it can be through the same mechanisms that we saw in Brave New World, mechanisms of persuasion as opposed to manipulation or coercion, but through influence and through persuasion, which is much more values aligned with what people actually want out of their lives, such that what the state wants, what the person wants, are actually quite similar, can persuade people then to do these behaviors that would otherwise be within their own internal milieu of the things they would like out of their lives. I am proposing that, yes, that is one of the goals, and this is what he was trying to show in The Island, is that these same techniques that were otherwise only viewed as being destructive to human flourishing could in fact be uplifting of the human spirit. So yes, you are correct in that.
Okay, well, I see that we're at time. Do we have time for one more? There's been a very patient questioner in the middle, so can we take your question, please?
Thank you once again for getting us into the conference. And my name is Victoria. I'm from University of Latvia as well as Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. And so I have one question which is related to the new EU policy on cookie regulations. So basically they establish for customers to choose which information they would like to share with the websites. And so they have this necessary information point. And I would like to ask, what do you consider as necessary information for people to share with the websites and applications? As, for instance, Mr. Applewhite has said in his speech about healthcare. And the second question, how much of freedom and regulation of your own information would you suggest for customers to, to establish themselves? Thank you.
Wow, okay. Well, We'll end with a good one. So I'm not an expert in EU cookie policy. I'm aware of the kind of changes to that. And in the UK, we've got a piece of legislation called PECR, which gets to that. What's necessary? There are certain cookie rules around, like, for example, a shopping cart, where we capture cookie information in order to enable the functionality of that. That's necessary in my mind. But when you get into health and care data, I think there would not be many categories of that type of data unless you were a very specialized organization providing a service to that person as part of a legislative mandate or a contract that you could actually say was required from a cookie perspective. That's my own view, again, not being an expert. I think, again, in terms of optimizing the digital self, if you accept that as a concept, I think as much control as you can give me, the better. because I will engage a system then around using my data for good, whether that's from a self-interested perspective or altruism or whatever the levers are. Having said that, I'm not always a fan of regulation, but I'm mostly a fan of regulation and of government. We will trade and should trade a certain amount of control in order to be protected and safe and potentially optimized. So I think there will be some trading of our control in return for benefit for us, just like we trade and negotiate other rights back to our governments to look after us. So that's a imprecise. So as much as possible, but I do think there is a role for government, a role for the alliance, a role for public sector organizations in helping us shape and make safe our digital selves. So I'd love a little bit of help sorting out fake news from real news. I'd love a number of things that would help me know whether I'm talking to a legitimate person or not on the internet. I think that's important in terms of our physical human interaction, and I think it's much easier to be mean, to be cruel, to do whatever we do on the internet when I'm not looking you in the eye. So I would love to see some help there where we begin with our digital selves to look one another in the eye. I would be really supportive of that, and we need help to do that. So I'm not sure I've precisely answered your question, but those are my ideas, such as they are. Anyone else on the panel want to weigh in quickly on that?
You know, it's funny, I figured I could not make a trip to the EU without getting asked about GDPR at least once. Yep.
Yeah, we almost made it. We almost made it.
I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out or a bad answer, because this is, I think, the best answer anyone can give you right now. It is going to be extremely context-specific. But I think, as Eric said, it's largely going to hewn back to what is the minimum quantity of information that that type of service would need to retain about you in any sort of semi-persistent manner, such as to give you the bare minimum of the value you're trying to get out of it. If it's a shopping cart and it forgets what you had each time you close your laptop, it's not a particularly effective shopping cart. You don't want a shopping cart with a bottom that falls out of the bottom. So I think to whatever you can do to fight for the minimum effective dose, so this idea from medicine that you doctors and physicians always try to give just about the smallest amount of medication that will get the job done. I think minimum effective dose might be an interesting perspective to take for the creators and storers of this kind of information, to see what is the smallest quantity that they can get away with actually having to collect and store persistently as to create the kind of value they need for their customer.
Okay, great question. So I think it's just for me to quickly pass the baton, but I did want to thank members of the panel and to thank you all for the opportunity to participate in your dialogue. We've thoroughly enjoyed it and hope we've provided an interesting thing, a seed or two. I've certainly learned a lot, and we want to thank our hosts, in particular Auntie and Rolf, but just the entire STRATCOM team that have been absolutely fabulous in bringing us to this great city and helping us meet you all. So thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I'll...
Well, thank you all. Fascinating panel. We now break for coffee, but we need to figure out what we do next after the coffee so that there's no confusion. We'll have 3 parallel sessions, right? And basically, in order to facilitate your choosing between where you want to go, right, we need to pitch the 3. Conference room A. Katie is going to stay as a moderator and continue the conversation on artificial intelligence. And Katie is going to be joined by Jarno Limnell and Patrick Tucker. Here you see all of them. Jarno, you're here? Patrick, you're here? Anywhere? Yes. Would you yes, can we get the microphone over there? Yes. Patrick, could you sell your panel so that it's not just the 3 of you? What do you think the direction should be, where you would take the conversation on artificial intelligence?
Well, I guess I'm hoping to, with my fellow panelists, talk about national security implications of artificial intelligence, both in terms of how the United States military and competing militaries are developing them, but also how advancements in artificial intelligence could create destabilizing social phenomenon, taking a look at that as well. So I spent all my time looking at the Defense Department and how it grasps artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies and the choices ahead of it. And there's a lot of choices, so I hope to get into it.
Cheers. Patrick, thank you very much. So that is your panel A in conference room A on artificial intelligence and security. Katie, Jarno, and Patrick over there. So please join them if you're interested in that topic. Conference room B, the second option you have, is going to be, wow, it's exciting, tech for the green man. And there's no dedicated moderator, conversation leaders, Ben Heap and Päivi Tampere. Päivi, you're here somewhere, anywhere? Yes, please. Would you care to give us a sense of where you're heading? Yes, the microphone. Can we get the microphone over there, please? Affecting human behavior for hybrid encounters. So I think the story is going to be on hybrid threats, right?
Yes, hi all. So we are going to discuss technology, human behavior, and hybrid threats. So how the hybrid environment affects our behavior, and how to respond, and how to be ready for different kind of situations.
Oh, that's great. Okay, that is your conversation group. If you're interested in hybrid aspects of all of this, conference room B, it's still our floor right next to the conference room A. But you have also the option to travel to the 11th floor. And there are a lot of Estonians there in that group. So that's, and the moderator is Kadri Küt. Kadri. Kadri, are you here? No, you're not here. We have Tarmo Randel, Ilmar Rag, and Mathis Vendal as well in that group. Any one of you here? Please, yes, please. So you're the only non-Estonian in the group, right? So you will have to defend this.
Yes. I was in the list as an Estonian, but I'm not. I'm Dutch, actually, but incognito. What we will be discussing about, is the role mostly of education and training and public information in keeping the challenges realistic and doable by focusing not on the big questions, but more on how you can, small steps, implement real training exercises to increase your knowledge and increase your resilience against all these new technologies which are affecting us on a daily basis.
Okay, 3 Estonians and a Dutchman. That is going to be on the 11th floor. That is going to be exciting. Right, good. So now we have a coffee break, and then you head up to the parallel sessions. And then it's lunch at 1 o'clock, and a book presentation as well, but I'll remind that when it comes closer. Okay, have a break, have a coffee, and thank you very much.